All right. Well, it looks like we've settled in with the crew we have. My name is Zach Coda. I'm a teacher naturalist at North Branch Nature Center. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We've got a really good crew, and I'm excited for our topic and our presenters tonight. A few things first. I want to make sure that everyone knows and how to mute themselves and keeps their microphones off unless we have a question period at some point. The presenters might invite you to unmute yourself. Or if you have a question, you can use the chat box. So feel free to ask questions or comment along in the chat box as well. If you do have trouble either seeing the presentation or you're not getting audio, one thing you can try is leaving the meeting and rejoining. Sometimes that works. And I'll also, in a moment, provide a PDF of the slides that we're going to see. So just in case something happens, you get disconnected, you can read through the slides and follow along the presentation. Yep.
Zach, you're muted.
Someone muted me.
So as Zach said, my name's Liza Morse, and I'm also here with Kevin Tolan, and collectively we make up the Grassland Bird Outreach Team at Vermont Center for Ecostudies. And tonight we're going to talk about grassland birds here in Vermont with a focus on bobolinks. For those of you who are on the call who are from outside of Vermont, a lot of what we're going to say is relevant in other parts of New England. So we're excited that you could join us. For those of you who aren't familiar with Vermont Center for Ecostudies, we're a nonprofit wildlife conservation research organization based in Norwich, Vermont. The majority of our work focuses on migratory birds, amphibians, vernal pool ecology, and native pollinators, but that, plenty of what we do spans even beyond those groups. A lot of the research that we work on involves probably many of you on the call because we rely very strongly on citizen scientists. These are just some of the projects that we coordinate that involve citizen science volunteers. And certainly if you're interested in getting more involved with VCE and with getting outside and doing some citizen science, you can visit our website to look at a complete list of projects. Kevin and I sort of occupy an unusual niche within VCE as an outreach team that is really focused on engaging landowners in management. So we do some monitoring. We work with landowners to do monitoring for grassland birds, but we predominantly focus on helping landowners manage their land for grassland birds. Plenty of our research or our work is informed, however, by research, much of which is still citizen science-based. So this is all to say that we couldn't do it without you, and we hope that you will continue to get involved with us even through this crazy time. So when we talk about grassland birds, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for the purposes of our work and for this presentation, what exactly do we mean when we say grassland bird? So there are plenty of birds. All the birds on this slide you may have seen in a grassland. A lot of people associate eastern bluebirds and American kestrels with grasslands and really enjoy putting nest boxes up for them. But most of these birds, like those species, either don't nest on the ground or use cavities in trees or nest boxes near grasslands. So any human activity that's actually going on directly in the grassland on the ground is not going to impact the breeding success of these species as directly as the birds that we're going to focus on tonight, which are our obligate grassland nesting birds. So these are birds that by nature nest on the ground, and so our agricultural activities really impact them. So here in Vermont, we have this suite of grassland birds that you see here on this slide. All of them are largely tied to human agricultural activity here in Vermont. We don't have native grasslands, so all of our grassland birds rely on these human-influenced pastures and fields. So here in Vermont, in the early to mid 1800s, about 80% of the land was cleared for pasture during sort of the merino sheep craze. And that made a lot more habitat available for these species. And then following the end of that industry, the state really returned predominantly to forest, and that's a really good thing. But what it means is that now we only have a much smaller proportion of the state in grassland, and we have much less habitat available to a lot of these species, which means that now the only grassland birds we have in any real numbers here, any significant populations, are our bobolinks, our Savannah sparrows, and to a lesser extent, our meadowlarks, which you can see at the top left of the screen. The other species, the grasshopper sparrow, the upland sandpiper, Henslow's sparrow, and sedge wren, are all state listed as threatened or endangered. And the eastern meadowlark has actually been recommended for state threatened status with an estimated population of less than 200 individuals, nesting at around 60 sites around the state. So for that reason, we really focus on these three species, the most prevalent grassland bird species in Vermont. And also not only because they're most prevalent, but also because they're the most feasible to manage for landowners, given they have smaller acreage requirements, and those acreage requirements jive more with what many private landowners actually have on their properties. Also, all three species have closer management or habitat requirements. So when you manage for one, you're more able to manage for the entire group. But among these three, we even focus in on one particular species, which is the bobolink, because that is sort of, even if you're not a birder, you're familiar with the bobolink. Landowners who have grasslands, who may not know any other bird species that lives on their property, is familiar with this bird because they're charismatic, they're loud, they're visible, and they're really kind of adorable, to use a non-scientific term. So they're a good ambassador species to manage for these other more unrecognizable or even rarer of the three species. But that gets me to the question, really, in a forested state, why do we care about these birds? Shouldn't we continue the reforestation process and say, grassland birds, you can live out in the Midwest? Well, the reason we care is that birds in general across North America are on a significant decline as a whole group of species. And within all bird species, grassland birds represent a group that is experiencing the most steep declines of any suite of bird species on the North American continent. So even though Vermont is a largely forested state, we have this agricultural heritage that I think many of us can agree we don't want to totally get rid of. And in those agricultural landscapes, we have the opportunity to manage in a way that supports grassland birds. So all grassland birds are declining, and the three species we're going to focus on tonight are no exception in this downward trend. These three graphs are data from the USGS Breeding Bird Survey. VCE helps coordinate the Vermont chapter of this effort. It's a citizen science effort going on nationwide. If you're interested, to learn more about it, you can contact Steve Fazio. He's the biologist at VCE who coordinates that. And all of the data that's been collected for the Breeding Bird Survey shows a decline of all three species that we're going to look at in the US and Canada. And you'll notice, perhaps unsurprisingly, given what we've already talked about, that the steepest decline is among the eastern meadowlark.
So that was a pretty quick dive into the ecology of grassland birds and the status of grasslands in particular. So Savannah Sparrow, it looks pretty similar to a song sparrow. It's pretty brown overall, except it has those really yellow lores, which are the eyebrows, kind of right in the area between the eye and the crown. So that makes it really well suited for camouflage in a grassland environment where there's a lot of browns, whites, and yellows and goldens. So they are really cryptic colored. They breed throughout a lot of Canada, the Northeast, and they winter in southern US, southeast US, down to Mexico. The only resident populations are in Southern California and Mexico, so there's a lot of movement. They breed in a little bit of shorter grass than a bobolink does. They go a little bit shorter, so they can handle a little more intense agriculture. They re-nest really readily. So in one season, if the nest keeps getting destroyed, females have been recorded re-nesting up to 5 times. That doesn't mean they're having 5 separate successful clutches, which would be called double clutching, which they can do. That's just if a nest gets destroyed for whatever reason, if they can start a new nest and still have time to fledge that before they have to migrate south for the winter. They frequently perch up on posts or tall grasses to sing, which makes them pretty easy to spot and even easier to hear. So I'll play their call real quick. It's sort of like a buzzy, kind of like a buzzy clip, 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 clip. It's a terrible impersonation. And actually, they're an interesting case study compared to some of our other grassland species, because in Vermont, their population is actually relatively steady. It's a little stochastic, so it's going up and down a lot, but it's not in quite that steep decline within Vermont that we see with bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks. And we're not entirely sure for that reason. It's likely a whole host of factors playing into it that could definitely be interesting to see how that plays out in the future. Can you go to the next? Yeah. This is a video that shows their migration pathway. This data is all collected from eBird, so it's all citizen science data. You can get the video to play.
All right. Sorry about that, guys.
Sorry about that. This is the eastern meadowlark that Liza mentioned as well. This is a really obvious bird. It's about pigeon-sized, so decently, it's pretty sizable. It is either a short distant or resident migrant, depending on where it is. And interestingly, their northernmost range is determined by the winter temperature. Studies have shown through Christmas bird count data, among other data sets, that meadowlarks won't winter in areas with the average winter temperature of below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a pretty interesting concept that they understand exactly where that limit is and will go south until they can reach a good region for them to survive the winter through. They have a very that very yellow breast with a black V-shaped necklace. They have a beautiful song as well that's often sung from either power lines or other perches. It's like a real whistle, distinctive song. So really whistle, drawn out. They require a little more land than bobolinks and Savannah sparrows do, which helps account for why their population is in decline, because when there's more fragmentation across the landscape, those large undisturbed patches of habitat aren't there anymore. And they also like slightly higher grass with a little bit more duff, like a little more of a leaf litter, dead grass cover on the bottom. And that's because they make Dutch oven shaped nests. So they use a lot of that duff to help build like a structure over their eggs. You can skip next to.
Yeah, and we can show these maps at the end when I can open up a different window.
And finally, the star of the show, the Dolichonyx oryzivorus, which in Latin means the long-clawed rice eater, which makes sense. If you see those long claws on that male at the top right of the screen, you see where that gets that name from. And it is known to either be found in rice paddies or consume rice, both during the winter and during migration. The male is a very obvious bird. It's a real like jet black breast, silver back with a bright yellow crown or golden crown. Females and non-breeding males are built much more for camouflage. So they have that buffy tan yellow coloration that helps them blend in with the grasses. They have an R2-D2-like song, which sounds like very robotic, but it's also very unforgettable at the same time. And they sing that the males kind of fly up out of the grass and almost do a display, like a circular display flight, almost like a wind-up toy is kind of what it reminds me of while singing that. And it's a really cool experience to be in the field with a bunch of males singing around your head when you can't see them because it's so early in the morning that it's dark out still. So they're just a really almost like a mysterious sound to hear. It's really, really cool. So this is a map that shows their global distribution. This also shows an interesting point into a limitation of citizen science data. If you see in South America, there's that large blue area, which is their wintering or non-breeding grounds. But research has actually shown through using radio or solar tracking backpacks that can help triangulate GPS locations, that there are a series of wintering grounds that are just underrepresented in this eBird data, either because it's a relatively remote area, or there's a lack of either access to technology, or people there just don't use eBird, which happens. Like depending where you are in the world, eBird is just not as commonplace as it is here. Their wintering is pretty centered in Paraguay and Argentina. Less than 25% stay in Bolivia, and I have no idea how few stay up in that Brazil circle at the way top. They are found mostly in rice-producing regions, but their diet consists of both rice and other crops, as well as a lot of grass seeds. They eat the rice during specific timing in their molt, so that's when their feathers are falling out and they're growing new ones. I'm not entirely sure if it's for a nutrient or something, but that's just an interesting discovery that VCE has helped find. When they migrate, so migration takes place March through May when they start leaving their wintering grounds. With this map, the darker the green, the more time is spent there. So you can see there are a couple places, mostly the wintering grounds, that people or migrating bobolinks will stay in before making that push up north. And they have a stopover for about 2 weeks to really refuel before they have to, before they go across the Caribbean to make landfall in Florida. And there's a big trade-off between either staying longer in South America to fuel up and be better suited for the Caribbean cross, or to leave sooner than later, perhaps not be as well suited for the crossing, but you reach the breeding grounds quicker. And then you'll be able to have the prime territory and establish it before other males get there. And generally, it's the older males that pull that high risk, high reward strategy of saying, okay, let's just go. I know, not waiting long here. Let's just get there. I'll set my territory. I've done it before. Same with the females. They have experience with the crossing. They've done migration before, especially if they've bred multiple times. So they feel more comfortable, or something similar to the sort, being able to go and get there earlier, compared to the younger males and females that may not feel as comfortable or may need more time to physically prepare for that long oceanic crossing. To make this, can you go back? Yeah, yep. Just to make this this navigation, they use both magnetic navigation and stellar navigation. So they have an iron oxide near their olfactory bulb, which is like in their beak and their nose. And they can use that to orient toward magnetic north. And then it's thought that they use the stellar navigation to act to set the declination almost, depending on the time of year. There's been extensive research in some other songbird migrants, unfortunately not with the bobolink yet, but it may have a similar strategy for these long distance migrations.
So bobolinks breed across most of the northern US and in southern Canada. And after having traveled around 6,000 miles, they show a pretty incredible fidelity to a faithfulness to returning to either the site where they were born or the site where they nested the year prior. So a lot of landowners will feel a real relationship to their bobolinks, so to speak, that they're the same birds that are coming back year after year. And this seems to have kind of a reproductive advantage, that bobolinks who have nested or established territories in a field in a prior year have more reproductive success in subsequent years than a new arrival to that field. You can see here, this is data from the second breeding bird atlas that was coordinated by VCE. And it shows breeding documented across the state of Vermont, though obviously anyone who knows the state well knows that, you know, the densities of breeding males and females will vary across the state. But it is interesting that no matter where you are, for the most part, here in Vermont, you can see bobolinks. Without going too much into their nesting requirements, I just want to mention sort of the checklist for a bobolink home hunter. So when they arrive here, they're really looking for as large as possible, unfragmented, contiguous fields with a minimum around 10 acres. And the smaller the field is, the more important that the field is really boxy or round in shape, because they really want to be nesting in the interior habitat of the field, away from any edges from trees or roads or other what we call fragmenting features. Like humans, they also really like having a good view. I like it, I think, just maybe for aesthetic reasons, but bobolinks, there's a perception of being safer from predators if there's a big open view. So they like fields in higher, that are elevated, that maybe don't have as many trees around them that block the view. And then within the field, having a good grass component, like you can see in this field pictured here, with only a small component of forbs, which are flowering plants. They really like well-drained soil. So if soil is if a field is too wet, they often will not nest there, or they will wait till the field has dried a little bit later in the spring. And obviously invasives are always bad news. So a field that's been invaded by chervil or some of our other grassland invasives here in Vermont are a no-go for bobolinks. Like any migratory songbird, bobolinks arrive at different parts of New England and Vermont at different times. But no matter when they arrive, no matter when they commence breeding, they follow a pretty standard schedule through the whole breeding process. So this is generally the schedule you're going to see no matter when breeding starts in your area. When the males arrive, the first thing they do is try to set up territories. So you're going to see a lot of singing and flying around in the field, and you probably will see some fighting between males and males chasing other males. And then as this period of competition progresses, you'll see the males sort of sticking close to particular areas of the field as they sort of settle into figuring out their own territories. Once the territories are established and the females have arrived, you'll see males starting to chase females and to continue to display with their flight songs. And actually females will tend to choose a male, to favor a male with a longer flight song, meaning the male is flying while singing while flying, which is kind of an unusual behavior. And females will favor males with longer flight songs because this means that that male has higher fat reserves and therefore has a greater potential for reproductive success. In general, bobolinks are predominantly polygynous, with males forming pair bonds with 2 or more females in his territory and that nest in his territory. But there's sort of 3 categories of bobolink male. So you have your monogamous male. They have a single paired mate that nests in their territory. You have your bachelor males. They're resident males. They, have a territory or they live in a particular field, but they don't have paired females nesting in their territories during the breeding season. And then you have your polygynous males, which are males with more than one mate nesting in his territory. And obviously, if you have more than one mate and you have more than one nest, that requires a lot of resources to help support multiple clutches. So polygyny is generally more common amongst males in resource-rich areas. All 3 of these groups sort of refer to the number of paired females a male has nesting in his territory, but all 3 types of bobolink males engage in what we call extra pair copulation. And so they're breeding with females outside of those mate pairings and with females who are in another male's territory. So it's a very high risk, high reward activity. So in bobolinks, what's interesting is that these extra pair copulations will often result in what we call multiple paternity, where this actually results in the clutch being sired by multiple male partners. So often mated males will end up caring for the young of other males besides themselves. And this is one of the first species where that's been documented among females. And this is possibly an explanation why the bachelor males can persist as a mating strategy among this species, because it actually seems to be fairly successful for them. Once they start nesting, the monogamous and polygynous males seem to center their territory around the nest site. The female nests on the ground and makes nests out of predominantly grasses and sedges. And they lay clutch sizes ranging from 2 to 7 eggs, although research here in Vermont has found an average Vermont clutch size of 4.7 eggs. Obviously, that's an average. You can't have less than an egg, but generally in that 5 egg window. Only the females incubate the eggs, but both parents will feed the young and will brood the young once the young have hatched. They feed the young within an hour of hatching, and the parents will also both clean the nest. That means they're carrying fecal sacs away from the nest. And so if you're out looking for bobolinks during this time, carrying food and nest cleaning, seeing them carrying these little fecal sacs are a really good sign that nesting is going on. The young leave the nest after about 10 to 11 days, and then they spend a week about more or less a week, largely flightless after fledgling. During that time, they're fed by the parents, and then even when they're able to fly, they continue to be fed for up to 28 days after leaving the nest. So then we get to fall migration, which begins at its earliest in late July here in Vermont, peaking in late August, with most bobolinks generally gone by late September, though there's an extreme record of a bobolink observed here on October 24th. And that was in the first breeding bird atlas. So, generally you're going to see most of the birds gone around September. And as they begin their migration, they are transitioning from a diet during the breeding season that was predominantly made up of insects to a diet, insects and invertebrates, to a diet that's primarily made up of seed, rice, the crops that Kevin mentioned. They stop off for about 3 to 6 weeks in a region known as the Llanos grasslands in Venezuela. Then they stop again in Bolivia, and then they continue on, well, most of them continue on to Paraguay, Argentina, and somewhat in Uruguay, although a small portion of them seem to stay in Bolivia for the winter. Interestingly, there's also a small group of bobolinks that stop off through the Galapagos on this southbound migration, and it's the only passerine bird, the only perching songbird that regularly is reported to stop in the Galapagos during migration.
So we just talked a bit about how grassland birds are in a pretty serious decline. So I'm going to go over why that is, and then Liza is going to talk about how we can help them. So they have a decent amount of threats, as do all birds right now. A lot of these threats we're going to be talking about in the lens of grassland birds, bobolinks in particular. But depending on the scenario, they can apply to almost every species of bird worldwide, if not most animals worldwide. So climate change, habitat conversion, intensive mowing, and grazing, predators and invasives are all some of the major threats that we deal with here. So climate change is one that, of course, is going to cause an issue. We don't really know the impacts that's going to have. And it's thought that it's going to increase heat, of course, increase likelihood of drought, and also increase extreme weather events such as extreme flooding. With the higher temperatures and droughts predicted, that is going to likely increase fire frequency. That's not currently an issue in Vermont, but in their native Midwest range, that is an issue. It's also going to impact food availability, both for bobolinks, because there's going to be less seeds and less insects in a drier environment. But of course, it's going to impact humans as well. We're likely to have less crops, and then we have to convert hayland to cropland, which would further reduce bobolink territory or habitat and food. Additionally, land that's conserved under some of the Farm Bill conservation programs is released from conservation during drought conditions or under excessive precipitation. So if we get either extreme weather or droughting, that might open up previously conserved land for agriculture. Additionally, extreme weather events such as flooding will destroy nests, which is more of that direct impact on birds. Intensive grazing and haying. Grazing is something that bobolinks evolved with. In their native Midwest, they had large ungulates in the form of bison. However, those bison were migratory, so they wouldn't stay in one area for too long. When you're grazing cattle in a stationary pen, the bobolinks are confined with the cattle in there, and it greatly increases the likelihood of the nest being trampled on. Because unlike in their native range historically, where they might have a day of heavy ungulate land use in the area, they'll move on soon after. And if there were any nests that were crushed, they could re-nest, and odds were they wouldn't get crushed again. When you're just in a landscape such as a bunch of paddocks and there's cattle everywhere, it's a really high likelihood of being trampled on. Intensive mowing is another big issue that's been extensively studied in the Champlain Valley. Mowing intensified as Vermont shifted from more of a sheep-based agricultural economy, century or so ago, to more of a dairy economy. And dairy needs more nutrient-rich hay, so they need to cut more frequently than they have in the past. Additionally, with increased use of fertilizer and mechanization, it's possible to get more cuts than they ever have been able to. So with more frequent cuts, those totally destroy nests, and the adults may not have enough time to either re-nest or for the grass to grow up to the proper height to be nested in again. So that's where a lot of this conservation comes around, is trying to keep these nests from getting completely destroyed by machinery. Habitat conversion to row crop or development is also a worldwide problem. For bobolinks, like all these problems, it exists range-wide. Here in the US, it's mostly as the dairy industry declines or changes depending on the area, it's conversion to either row crop or development because it might be more economic. But if you think about that Llanos grassland that Liza mentioned during their spring migration, or during their fall migration, that's in Venezuela and Colombia, when the birds are there in migration, the entire world's population of bobolinks was within that one little circle. So just very high concentrations. And so that's a new frontier of sorts for a lot of, for both those nations. And so as development and agriculture in the region increases, that's going to be potentially very harmful to the extremely concentrated group of bobolinks that nest there. Predation is natural, so we don't want to demonize predators because bobolinks and other grassland birds have evolved anti-predator behaviors. They have really well-hidden nests, and they nest far away from the edges, which reduces predation. They also are pretty sneaky when they return to their nests. If you ever watch a bobolink carrying food back to its nest, it may land one place for 3 seconds, fly up, land on the other side, like 10 feet away, and make a couple different jumps before finally landing where their nest is. So they will try and fool you and be like, is my nest over here, or is it over here, or it's over here? Or they'll land close to the nest and then just walk to the nest. So even if you see where they land, you don't necessarily know where their nest is. So natural predation isn't the issue. The issue is that humans tend to artificially inflate predation populations. So introducing either outdoor cats or barn cats is a big issue because that increases, of course, the predators in the area. But also just human food sources such as either trash or an agricultural setting, grain and feed leads to higher densities of natural nest predators because of the higher food availability. That's less common in more rural areas, but it is still a concern, especially if there's lots of mice or rats that will also go and then predate nests. So when it really comes to management, you need to think about how you can support bobolinks and other birds to be able to defend themselves by not increasing A, the fragmentation so they can keep high in their nests well, and B, by not exacerbating the problem by artificially inflating these predation levels. I'll say it again, cats are probably the biggest issue. They're the #1 direct human-caused threat to birds in the US and Canada. And so they're an invasive and they're a predator. They kill about 2.4 billion birds a year predicted. And grassland birds that nest on the ground are especially susceptible because they can't get in a tree to get away from a hunting cat. They are on the ground and physically cannot really escape or do better than hiding their nest than how they're doing it now. So they're a real big threat, especially to grassland birds. And that includes all feral cats, barn cats, indoor cats that are sometimes left outside. They're all they can be relatively destructive to bird populations. And then also, as Liza mentioned before, invasive plants. She mentioned wild chervil. Also, yellow rattle is a newly introduced plant to Vermont, and that's a hemiparasitic plant. So it will tap into the nutrients of grasses and actually suck the nutrients out of them. So that can be really destructive to large areas of field if it really takes over. And once it takes over, it can be hard to get rid of.
So now that Kevin has officially put a damper on all of our spirits, I'm going to talk about the opportunities for conservation and end on a positive note. So some work from VCE on looking at opportunities for conservation for bobolinks in their nesting grounds has found, you know, a lot of opportunities for conservation. This metric, this map, used things like the relative abundance of bobolinks in a region, the risk of grassland loss in that region, the area of existing protected grasslands in that region, and many more factors to calculate the potential for successful conservation across the breeding region. If we focus in on New England, we see that Vermont has a surprisingly high, skews high on the opportunity scale, which is maybe surprising for a forested state. But as you see within the map to the right, we still have a fairly good distribution of grasslands that qualify as, or may qualify as, bobolink habitat. So using that 10-acre minimum, this map shows every field or every parcel that is 10 acres or above in pasture or hay field. That amounts to around 15,000 parcels at about a total of 500,000 acres. And that's actually 8% of Vermont's total land base. So there's definitely an opportunity here for managing in a way that supports grassland birds. That's exactly what we do at VCE. So this is Roz Renfrew. She's working with the landowner. She's the former grassland bird biologist with VCE, and a lot of the work we do is based on her research and this program that she began. Now, Kevin and I do site visits with landowners, and we work with them to help them balance their challenges with the needs of the birds. This year, we're really excited to roll out a new recognition sign for these landowners. So if you're interested in doing a site visit with us, please get in contact, and we'll share that contact information later on in the presentation. Without going too far into it, these are sort of the general list of strategies we discuss with landowners when talking about grassland bird management. So when we're thinking about managing, we're thinking about the habitat characteristics that the bobolink requires, and also about how management activities are going to give them sufficient time to complete nesting. So that means considering the needs of the landowner, potentially the needs of a farmer that cuts for them if they don't cut the hay themselves, the needs of the birds, and the ways that all of these management decisions may or may not heighten the risk of predation. So these are some of the main strategies: monitoring the birds and figuring out when exactly they're nesting, and when they're done nesting, then using that to inform your mowing schedule, or relying on previous research that suggests that certain schedules are preferred, using particular mowing strategies, as well as prioritizing where you mow, when you mow, or where you're putting your animals if you are rotationally grazing. So I will talk briefly about the sort of the main strategies, but this is sort of a more comprehensive list of what might come up with a landowner. So in general, the silver bullet, so to speak, for managing for grassland birds is to wait to hay until August 1st. Now that's a date that's estimated for Vermont and New Hampshire, and I would hesitate to extrapolate out to any of the other New England states. Certainly they have recommendation guidelines themselves. In general, this date holds true for most of Vermont and New Hampshire, although, as I said, there's regional variation. But as you can see in this graph, August 1st is the date by which most nests have successfully fledged, and the time at which most young can successfully fly away from a mower. So that's the ideal date. And if you mow any earlier than that date, what you're doing is risking young that maybe can have left the nest but can't successfully fly away from the mower. Another strategy that's been developed to help farmers who really need to get in that second cut, this has been developed in the Champlain Valley, of cutting before June 1st, waiting 65 days to allow sufficient time for grass regrowth and breeding, and then doing a second cut. It's important to note that this has been only tested in the Champlain Valley, and so may not be feasible for other regions of Vermont, but is certainly worth mentioning, as there are a lot of pressures on farmers that may make this the only viable option. Then one of the main things that comes up is prioritization. So figuring out where, if you have multiple fields or you're intending to do rotational grazing, you know, if you have multiple paddocks, which field or paddock represents the best bobolink habitat, and then delayed mowing on that property, on that field, and then cutting the other fields to meet your financial and your farm's bottom line. So, you know, as Kevin said, these birds have developed with ungulates on the landscape. It is certainly possible to include cattle or other livestock within the paddock where the bobolinks are nesting, but the risk increases with time and with density of the livestock in that paddock. So if at all possible, we recommend leaving the cattle out of the ideal nesting area. And then finally, for landowners who really cannot delay till August 1st, there are some strategies to help try to allow the fledged young hop away from the mower and prevent them from getting hit directly, so that they have a chance of succeeding and reaching the point where they can fly. All of these things are complicated and they vary from site to site, from property to property, and different properties have different needs. So that's, you know, what we talk about with landowners when we do a site visit or when we have a phone call with someone. So please get in touch with us if you are interested in learning how to manage these birds on your landscape at grasslands@vcecostudies.org. Other resources include UVM Extension. We're bird experts, they're grass experts. So if you have questions that are more specific to the actual vegetation in your grassland habitats, they're certainly the ones we would point you to. And if financial support is really a deal breaker for you and you have sufficient acreage, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has their EQIP program, which for landowners with 20 acres or more will compensate you for delayed mowing. That program is somewhat limited in geographic scope, I believe only to the Champlain Valley and Upper Valley, but it's certainly worth getting in touch with your local NRCS representative to learn more. And then also the Bobolink Project is a privately funded project through donations. It's a cooperative of Audubon Vermont and Mass Audubon. And they also compensate farmers for delayed mowing. We have a number of resources on the VCE website, both an ID sheet if you are maybe not a bird enthusiast, but you want to learn more about birds on your grassland property. You don't have to go buy an expensive guide. You can just print out our ID sheet. It has our priority species and some of the species you might confuse them with. And we also have a nesting calendar with the generalized schedule for Vermont and New Hampshire to help you, as you're observing bobolinks, understand where in the breeding schedule they might be and understanding behavior. And if you don't have grasslands, there are plenty of ways for you to support grassland birds and grassland bird conservation. I think the number one thing is to just go birding in general and get to know these birds and to submit your data to eBird. So go out, take a checklist, submit it to eBird. It's one of the best things you can do to help scientists understand more about bird populations. And then if you really want to target that effort, you can help a neighbor who does have grasslands monitor their own fields. And if that's something you're interested in, definitely get in contact with us. We can train you on our monitoring protocols so that you can go do that this spring and summer. You can also act as an ambassador for these species to your neighbors. We can certainly send you some brochures if you have neighbors you'd like to get in touch with. And we can arm you with information to help get other people engaged with managing for grassland birds. And finally, probably the easiest thing you can do right now while we're all stuck at home is to donate to groups that are working to help grassland birds. So that includes us at Vermont Center for Ecostudies, the Bobolink project that I mentioned previously, Audubon Vermont, as well as Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And with that, I'd like to end our slideshow and thank you all for listening in. And if you'd like to learn more about what VCE does generally and follow the work that we're doing, there's plenty of ways to do that and to get involved. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we also have an e-news and a print field notes publication that comes out biannually. So you can subscribe to those things on our website. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liza and Kevin, both of you for sharing so much about grassland birds and the work that VCE has done and continues to do. We have a few questions. The first question is from Ellen, and that's a similar question to one that I've had for a long time. When we're traveling around Vermont and seeing different open spaces, how do we know what constitutes a grassland versus a hayfield versus shrub versus a pasture? Can you explain more about maybe how we define these different landscapes and habitats, and maybe do you have any resources for us to better understand what these places are and what might be living there?
I'd say that hayfields are a type of grassland. Grasslands, by definition, are, I'd say, mostly made of monocots with occasional forbs mixed in. And when you go to the prairies out west, there's two forms of grassland. You have the tall grass and the short grass. And we're kind of a mid-grass because we're using a mix of species in our agricultural landscapes that will have a kind of a mixture between the two different types of prairie. So I'd say that hayfields are a form of grassland, and they're the form of grassland that we have here because we don't have native grasslands. We have artificial grasslands that have to be hand sown with these specific seeds. As for shrubland, I say it comes shrubland as soon as woody growth starts popping up, and that's probably only going to take a couple years if you don't mow every year.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think when people think of woody growth, they think of actual shrubs. Woody growth is as insignificant as a single stem, and even before that, there's a lot of Vermonters who have these open areas that they don't hay, but they really like them for aesthetic reasons. And often they will brush hog or mow in September or October. And that will result in a lot of your goldenrods and your asters coming up, which are great for pollinators. But we generally encourage landowners with enough acreage to encourage those grass species by cutting earlier in the summer. Not so early that it's going to impact birds, but you want to get it back to grass or to keep it in grass. You want to be mowing every year, and you want to be mowing sometime in August or September, depending on the site. If you're waiting and allowing some of those forbs to really take over, you're going to create great pollinator habitat, but you probably will transition it away from productive grassland bird habitat. So there's you have the grassland condition, and then as things sort of get shrubbier and scrubbier, you have the old field condition, and that's where you're going to get your pollinators, but also probably some woodcock potentially if it's a wet site, and turkeys definitely like that kind of condition. And then you get more into your shrubland, and then you're approaching, your chestnut-sided warbler kind of shrubland bird habitat. I think all of us kind of actually have a search image for all of these different types of gradations along that succession path, and it's just a matter of someone pointing it out to you. But when we were talking about what constitutes grassland habitat, you really need that 10-acre minimum, and then the smaller you get towards that 10 acres, the more and more important it is that the entire 10 acres is really good quality vegetation and habitat.
Yeah, and Liza, you used a great botany word there, forbs. So talking about that that plant growth that isn't grass, as opposed to the graminoids, which are like the real grassy or grass-like plants. So once you start getting those other plants growing there besides grass, you're moving on that spectrum away from a grassland and maybe towards something else.
Exactly. And one thing to remember too for people who don't hay their grasslands, but they brush hog, is that the difference between haying and brush hogging, you're cutting in both situations, but in brush hogging, usually people are leaving the material on the field. And so that can really alter, the chemistry, the soil composition, a lot of things. But it also adds sort of this litter layer of dead vegetative material. And grassland birds only, at least the species we have here that we're managing for, only like a certain amount of litter. So you really only want to remove that you really want to try to remove that at least every few years if you're doing that for grassland birds.
Right.
I'd say another interesting thing along with that litter layer she mentioned is how our human management here emulates the Midwest. In the Midwest, they have fires, as I mentioned earlier, which acts to clear out that litter layer. So here we have to emulate that by physically removing that litter layer. So kind of, again, like how does it relate to their native grassland prairie habitat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that actually answered another question as well that Kathy was asking about management. It seems like folks are really curious about how to manage these grassland habitats, meadows and such for birds. And Mark is curious about what is happening. We're seeing a lot of changes on our landscape due to changes in agriculture. So I've noticed this in my lifetime as dairy farms have declined precipitously. The amount of both pasture and hay field has disappeared, and farmers are sometimes selling their land for development to become homes. But more frequently now I'm seeing hemp fields. Mark has noticed hemp fields and also these large solar arrays, which are all often being installed in former hay fields. And I'm wondering if you folks have any idea about how those changes might affect grassland birds.
I mean, certainly a solar field. So I mentioned that I use the term fragmenting features. These are things that really disrupt the sort of that, far as the eye can see type experience in a grassland. And if you're thinking from literally a bird's eye view as a bobolink comes in over the landscape, they want both a contiguous grassland within a specific field to nest in, but then they also want that landscape level fields nearby. And, you know, a big solar array is going to be an automatic no for males coming in. So as far as, you know, the actual effect on at a population level, I couldn't speak to that, but for that particular field, I can certainly say with confidence that that would mean no nesting in that area. On speaking to the decline in agriculture, which is happening across New England, it's not just a Vermont problem. There's a report out, Wildlands and Woodlands, I believe, which is out of the Highstead Foundation in Massachusetts. They did a report on land use change in New England, and they have documented that, you know, for the first time in a long time, forests are declining. But also one of the fastest declining land cover types in New England are agricultural landscapes. So, you know, even as agricultural activity itself can really threaten grassland birds through intensification, it's important to remember here in New England, since we don't have any native grasslands, there's like blueberry barrens in Maine that qualify as grasslands for some species, but you know, these artificial grasslands wouldn't exist without our farmers and without our agricultural landscape. And so, and also it's where we get our food. So, you know, it's important to keep it around for a number of reasons. And really what it's getting converted to at this point is not back into forest, but into development. So pavement doesn't help anyone. And that's certainly a real problem for grassland birds.
I'd like to add also that we have a feeling in ourselves that we want to conserve what's around us, and so there is a temptation that all people may have that, oh, I won't hay my field, I'll buy hay from someone else or something along those lines, and then you have the whole importing of the hay, and the hay is coming from somewhere. If it's coming from in Vermont, and maybe coming from potential bobolink habitat. So there's also that larger scale as well. Like, how do you manage between the two, between wanting to conserve bobolinks on a larger scale and wanting to conserve them on that smaller scale in your immediate area?
Yeah, and that's where the prioritization or decision making comes in. You know, you need that hay, so it's better to get it from your own property for a number of reasons. But then, can that allow you to delay mow in the prime habitat for bobolinks? Or maybe you have what could be bobolink habitat, you know, maybe you have 9.5 acres and it's in good hay condition. Well, you know, personally, I would say hay that, and then help a neighbor who has more acreage, help encourage them to actually delay mow.
All right, we have, you know, a little bit more time for questions. If anyone else has a question they want to ask, this has been a really awesome opportunity to talk to some experts about grassland birds and habitat. So if anyone else has something they'd like to ask, now's the time. Of the grassland birds in Vermont, you know, which one should we be the most concerned about? And if folks are interested in going to see them, where are some good places where folks can go and get to know some of these species?
I guess that depends. Like, for some of these species that are just so rare in the state, where there's only one nesting pair, or two max in the case of the upland sandpiper, there's one place to go see them. There's not like a lot of places in Vermont you can go see those guys, unfortunately. I know that Shelburne Farms has a lot of bobolink, has a high bobolink population. I've seen meadowlarks there. So if you're in the Burlington area, that's a great place to just walk around, see a lot of really nice, well-managed fields. I'm not sure, Liza, if you have any others over there.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with Shelburne Farms is that you have to pay for starting May 1st, I believe, although actually your local library, you can get passes to Shelburne Farms from your local library. So highly recommend that. But even the bobolink I saw earlier this month was at, what's it called? Eagle Hill Mountain, or Eagle Mountain Natural Area in Milton, which isn't a huge grassland area, but it had a male bobolink there. So there's certainly the Champlain Valley. There are more opportunities for that.
Yeah.
But, and the other thing, as Kevin said, is some of them you actually can't get to. So most of the grasshopper sparrows are on airports or Camp Johnson, the military base. So you actually can't go see them. So that's a little unfortunate. Certainly, if you find out about an eastern meadowlark observation near you, I would go check that out because they definitely are one of our rarer species.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I concur with that. Like even in Champlain Valley, like G. Prags Park has a smallish grassland, kind of more shrubby. I've seen bobolinks at the Catamount Outdoor Center in Williston. I've been talking to their land manager, and they've stated they have a historic breeding population there. I haven't personally visited it yet, so I can't really talk to that. But I've heard they have some decent fields there. Check eBird. That's the best way to find them. I think you'll see the hot spots. You'll see where the meadowlarks have been found. I say it's definitely the most efficient way to find some nice spots for them.
And if I've seen some more management questions in the chat box that we probably don't have time to answer, but we are answering emails about this all day. So please get in contact with us, grasslands@vcecostudies.org. You can also find that on our website. And we're happy to email with you, have a phone call with you. We've done some pretty productive Zoom calls with maps and discussing management that way. And then hopefully when we're able to do some site visits, once again, we can come do a site visit at your property.
Yeah, I'd say Kathy, email Grasslands with either a screenshot of like a Google Earth image of your house or your address, and we'll get back to you with some suggestions, because it's a lot easier to really make good suggestions when you see the landscape. Depending on like the shape of your field, your surroundings, your neighbors, there's a lot at play on if it could be either a productive 10-acre meadow or it could just be not worth the trouble of trying to conserve it for grasslands.
And I'll also say that, we love grassland birds, but we also love all other birds. And so if you have a meadow that's sort of converting into shrubland, Audubon, Vermont is a great resource in understanding more about shrubland bird management on your property.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Liza and Kevin, for joining us tonight. Thank you, everyone who joined our program and asked great questions. And thank you to everyone who is participating in this amazing program and helping to conserve grassland birds.